Ahoy everyone, I'm Nazir North and welcome to the channel. Like most of us, I probably spend way too much time on my phone, and a lot of that is spent on the various Dungeons and Dragons subreddits. And while I do often see questions about interesting or uncommon rule interactions or amazing stories from DMs and players, I do also see a lot of the same problems and queries cropping up again and again. So what I'd like to do in this video is summarise some of the most common D&D issues that are posted to Reddit and talk through how we can resolve them. It almost goes without saying that this is all quite subjective, it's based on my own experience and there is no one right answer to a lot of this stuff. But, you know, that is what the comment section is there for. Whether you agree or disagree with what I'm saying, leave a comment and keep the debate going in the comment section below. Let's get started on question 1. Is this race, class, magic item or monster that I found on the DnD Wiki balanced? No. No, it's not. There is some great homebrew out there, but 99% of the time when people come with this question, what they're actually linking to on the D&D Wiki is completely overpowered nonsense. In particular, player options like races and classes are usually the worst offenders here, especially when it comes to balance. The issue with homebrew that you find online is that it was just made by some random person. While it might be well written and look interesting, it probably hasn't gone through any peer review or play testing, and oftentimes even proofreading. That might sound hypocritical coming from me because returning viewers of the channel will know that I post quite a lot of my own homebrew online as well. But I'm not saying don't use homebrew, I'm just trying to encourage DMs out there to scrutinise what they find rather than just take things on face value. As you can find a lot of homebrew out there that looks really well polished. You know, it has artwork, great layout and design, links to their Patreon or Kickstarter or whatever, but then you read the actual content and it's not very good. Either it's bland and flavourless, maybe it copies something official that already exists and is better designed, or, more commonly, it's just extremely overpowered. If you do find some homebrew online that you would like to use in your own campaign, try and gauge what other DMs are saying about it. If you find it on Reddit, for example, have a read through the comments. What do other DMs think about the balance? Or if it's a product on the DM's Guild, for example, have a look at the reviews, have a look at the ratings and see what people are saying. The choice whether or not to include something in the game will ultimately come down to you. So the best advice I can give really is don't include homebrew unless you feel confident that it is balanced with the rest of the campaign you're building. And that is normally something you can only answer as you gain more experience as a DM. Therefore, it's not advisable for newer DMs to be including homebrew in their games. Run a rules as written campaign first so you can get a feel for how the rules and mechanics work before you start to introduce new things. Referring back to the question itself, there is a specific issue here as well with the D&D Wiki. This is not a site I would recommend to any Dungeon Master, whether you are a newer DM or a veteran. That's because just anyone can sign up, write any old rubbish and press submit. I could go on there and make a monk subclass called the Way of the Minigun, give them 500 hit points and a magic minigun that insta-kills anything. I press submit and there you go, that's out there on the internet forever. It doesn't have to go through any kind of testing or validation process. And it is a bit of a trap as well. Calling it the D&D Wiki implies that it is this sort of font of information, and in particular it's newer players and newer DMs that end up going there and thinking this stuff is official content, or at least content that is balanced when in fact it very rarely is. Okay, enough bashing on the D&D Wiki. The last point I want to address for this question and questions like it is something that DMs should really be laying out for their players in session 0 before the campaign starts. And that is going to be what player options are available to players in the campaign setting that you're running. Now, most DMs might just say, hey, we're going to start up a new campaign, go and build some characters, we're going to start at level 3. But I would add to that you do need to set some boundaries. Most importantly, you should say whether or not any homebrew is allowed, and if so, from what source. The most broken and overpowered stuff you see online is the stuff that players themselves find or create that they want to use for their own characters. Personally, as a Dungeon Master, I'm pretty strict on homebrew classes and races, particularly where they don't fit the setting that I'd like to run the campaign in. And I would strongly advise newer or less rules-savvy DMs to outlaw homebrew classes and races completely. When you run your Session 0 as a DM and you start to talk to the players about which sources are allowed for their character builds, the best thing you can do is to use either the Player's Handbook +1 rule, or the core books +1 rule. All this is that you say to the players you can choose anything from the Player's Handbook plus this one other book of your choice. And that could be a book that the DM chooses, or perhaps you decide that +1 book collectively as a group. So for example, if you're playing a campaign in the Eberron setting, maybe you will choose the Eberron book as your +1. Or if you're playing a campaign with more of an ancient or classical history vibe, then your +1 book might be the Odyssey of Theros book. Either way, you get all of the core character options from the Player's Handbook, plus one more book for some added flavour. And you can go one step further and use what I normally use, which is the core rules +1. So that is the Player's Handbook, Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, for a good generic pool of player options. And then you still pick one flavour book to add on top. Let's say the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount if you're playing a game in the Critical Role setting. Or even the Dungeons of Drakkenheim or Sandy Peterson's Cthulhu Mythos if you're playing a game in a homebrew setting. That +1 book doesn't have to be official material. I find that limiting the rule choices is actually really good for the coherence of the party as well, as you don't tend to have too many wild options that divert from the main theme of your campaign. And by ruling out Strixhaven, unless that is your +1 book, you can also prevent every single caster in the party from taking silvery barbs. Thank me later. Okay, let's move on to question 2. My players find combat too easy. How do I challenge them? There are a lot of variations to this kind of question that we see on Reddit, and it usually comes from a DM who has just had their players walk all over some big boss battle they'd set up, or the party have just breezed through some other kind of encounter that the DM has designed. And while I have seen people talk about this and post these kind of questions about all tiers of play, things tend to get more disproportionate in terms of encounter balancing as characters get past level 10 onwards, so into tiers 3 and 4 of play. That's where DMs seem to have most issues with this kind of thing. So if the players are finding combat too easy, there can be a few common causes for this. Number 1, the DM isn't using daily encounter budgets correctly. Maybe they just run one big encounter per day where the players are fully rested and at their strongest. If this is the case, DMs need to make sure that the players face multiple encounters per adventuring day, wearing down their resources before they get a chance to take that long rest. My general rule is to be generous with short rests, let the party take them most of the time when they ask for one, but be strict with long rests. Remember that the party can only take one long rest every 24 hours, they can't just lay down and have a nap after every fight. And if they do try and do this, the area is probably still dangerous if they've just finished an encounter. It's always handy as a DM to have a few roaming enemies in your back pocket for this exact scenario. The second cause could be that the DM has been too generous and has handed out way too many powerful magical items to the party. If you have a party that's fully kitted out in +3 weapons and +3 armor by the time they reach level 10, you've gone way too far. Cause number 3, the DM has allowed players to use broken and overpowered homebrew races, classes or items, making balancing encounters extremely difficult. And cause number 4, one that is becoming more and more common, is players who have a highly optimized character build, and maybe even an entire party full of optimized characters. These players might be playing completely by the rules, but they've just gone with build ideas they've seen online to try and get a character that is very, very good in one particular role in combat. A very popular one, for example, is this idea of Nova damage, where you can do a lot of damage in one round, usually just the first round of combat. And these kind of players can be difficult for DMs to balance monsters against. Okay, those are some of the causes of this issue, but what are the solutions? The easiest answer to this problem is to simply increase the frequency and difficulty of your combat encounters. So that means more combats per day using a higher challenge rating of monster. Even if you're already using your daily encounter budgets to build your encounters correctly, then simply increase that budget. Try adding another 10, 20 or 30% to that total to see how the party cope. The more complex solution, but one that is probably going to be far more effective in the long term, is to make your combat encounters more strategic. Namely, don't just have a bunch of melee only monsters run in a straight line towards the party. Any group is going to find that type of encounter pretty easy and probably pretty boring. Get a mix of foes engaged in the battle. Melee, ranged and spellcasters, including some that have special movement speeds. Perhaps flying, burrowing, ethereal movement or teleportation. Also make sure you have a mix of different offensive abilities that your monsters can use. Not just your standard attacks that target armor class, but also some that require a saving throw. Bonus points if you can target those saving throws that players aren't always very good at, rather than just dexterity and wisdom, which the party are usually prepared for. And also remember to have some attacks that just target a single creature and some that can have an area of effect. Make sure that there is a lot of variation to keep the party on their toes, preventing them from using the same tactics over and over in every fight. Remember to use the terrain to the advantage of the monsters. Add in things like elevation, cover, hazards, difficult terrain, traps, and other features on the map that the monsters can benefit from. I could spend a long time talking about how to make combat more interesting, but I do have an entire separate video on building dynamic combat encounters. I'll link that video in the corner now if you're interested in going deeper into that subject. Next up, question 3 is it okay to run a DMPC? For any of you who might not be aware, a DMPC is exactly what it sounds like. It's a character created using player character rules, so they aren't using an NPC stat block, they have a regular character sheet, and they're a member of the party directly controlled by the Dungeon Master. There are a number of reasons why a DM, particularly a newer DM, might think this is a good idea. Maybe the party that they're playing with doesn't have a healer or it doesn't have a tank, so the DM decides to insert their own character to fill that perceived gap. Maybe they are running a small party, just 2 or 3 players, so they do this to make up the numbers. Or sometimes you have a DM that just wants to have their cake and eat it. They want the control and creativity of being a dungeon master, but they also want some spotlight time as a hero, as one of the protagonists of the campaign. While some of this stuff may sound sensible in principle, DMPCs are almost always a bad idea. First of all, it's going to be literally impossible not to metagame. As a DM running a DMPC, you have both the monster stat block and the player character sheet in front of you. Even if you try your best to roleplay and not to factor it in, you already know what resistances or immunities the monster has. You know how all of its attacks and effects work, you know what spells it has prepared, you know which of its saving throws are the strongest and which are the weakest. Right out of the gate, your character has a distinct advantage over the other player characters at the table. Next, there is the issue of stealing the spotlight. Your players are meant to be the heroes of the campaign. The DM shouldn't be taking that away from them or diluting it by hogging some of that glory themselves with their own character. There is a real conflict of interest there. It's like being the referee for a game which you are yourself competing in. And lastly, it's just too much to manage. As a DM, you already have your attention split in so many different ways. Managing different monsters, NPCs, world building, roleplay and rules adjudication. Having to also manage a player character directly is not a good use of your time and effort. You should really be more focused on running the game, not trying to be a player as well at the same time. The only time I can really see a DMPC working in a campaign is maybe when the DM has stepped in to cover for a player who couldn't make the session, or if the DMPC is accompanying the party only on one very short quest and then leaving again. But even in that scenario, I'd recommend running an NPC with a stat block rather than building that character from the ground up using player character rules. You're just creating more work for yourself as the DM. Moving on to question 4, we have: how do I allow the BBEG to drop some exposition without the players attacking them the first time they meet? Again, for those of you who may not know all of the D&D jargon, BBEG is the big bad evil guy or the big bad evil gal. This is usually the main antagonist of your campaign, the character that the PCs are trying to hunt down and stop. A lot of DMs like the idea of the bad guy being able to address the players directly, maybe with some diabolical speech announcing their evil plan, or to taunt or insult the players, or to maybe harm a friendly NPC, or burn down a character's hometown, or do some other evil thing that helps to motivate the party to go after them and to grab onto that plot hook. And sometimes that means facing the bad guy in person. And the things that the DMs who ask these kinds of questions are worried about is what is stopping the party from attacking them on sight? And if they do, why wouldn't the bad guy just kill them there and then to save themselves a problem further down the line? As this kind of scenario is something the DM usually wants to insert in the early stages of a campaign, well before the party are strong enough or high level enough to actually beat the bad guy. So what they're really asking is, how do I get this NPC to do something dastardly around the party but not have it result in combat? Let's run through some ideas of how you could do this in practice. One method that is a little overused but is tried and tested in fantasy fiction is the dream sequence or long distance telepathy, maybe even using the sending spell. If you need the bad guy to get some kind of message to the party, just have them do it remotely, then there is no risk of actual combat. And you could even choose to have this message be one way, preventing the party from even responding. Along a similar vein, you can have details of the bad guy's plot revealed through journals, letters, logs, or diaries that the party find during their adventures. This way you can do a bit of a lore dump in the bad guy's own words without them interacting directly. In fact, by that point in your campaign, the bad guy may not even know that the party exists. Again, a very similar idea to this is just to have another NPC talk to the party about the bad guy. Maybe a veteran warrior who once faced the bad guy on the battlefield many years ago, or an NPC who has defected from the bad guy's organisation and is now spilling their secrets to the party. However, if you really do want that face-to-face interaction between the bad guy and the party, then there are still some options we have available to us. First and foremost, the bad guy could be in disguise, or perhaps their true identity has yet to be revealed. The exposition you want to unload in the game could be delivered by somebody that the party believes is a friendly or neutral NPC, who only later turns out to actually be the bad guy. Additionally, even though it is what that question is trying to avoid, you can have direct confrontation between the bad guy and the party, but given that the bad guy's probably so much stronger than them at this point, they can just teleport away once they've said what they want to say. Maybe they think the party aren't even worth their time to deal with, or the party just aren't on their radar yet. The last point I'll make on this question is that sometimes less is more. Sometimes the foe we fear and respect the most is the one that we actually know very little about. One whose face we may never even have seen. And the best example we can take from this from fiction is Sauron from The Lord of the Rings. Everyone knows he is the bad guy. He is the encapsulation of evil in Tolkien's setting, but he never shows his face during the War of the Ring, and our heroes never directly confront him. Yet still he is a great and memorable villain. Okay, and the final question we're going to cover in this video, and it is a relatively quick one, number 5 is, how do I force this insert predetermined outcome on the party? Now, for our other questions, I've intentionally left them generic enough that you understand the gist of what the DM is asking without having to paste in specific questions from users on Reddit into the video. However, for this one, I've actually seen so many very, very closely related questions on Reddit that I think I'm going to give the exact scenario that crops up again and again. You have a variation of, I'm going to start this new campaign where the players die in their very first session and then the real campaign begins in the afterlife, maybe in hell or the underworld or some other realm. And as a premise for a campaign, I think that actually sounds quite interesting. However, the issue is the DM doesn't tell the players this. The DM is fully intending on letting the players build their characters at level 1, starting the campaign on session 1, then about halfway through the session having some unwinnable combat that the players are forced through. The DM is going to run it in initiative, probably against some monster that has infinite hit points, or immunity to all damage, forcing the party to lose. Now, this is awful. This is going to be a terrible experience for players when they realise that they've been railroaded and had absolutely no agency or control over that combat encounter. And this isn't the only example. You see a lot of similar scenarios. Another common one is where the DM wants the party to get captured or imprisoned for whatever contrived story reason they've come up with, so forces an encounter to go that way. Maybe again another unwinnable battle where at the end the monsters just knock the players unconscious and then handcuff them and drag them away. The problem with these kind of storylines is that the DM plays them out and the players believe they have choice and control, but what's actually happening is like a cutscene in a video game. The players are going through the motions and pressing the buttons, but it's not doing anything. The DM has already predetermined the outcome. And as a story beat in general, this kind of stuff can be fine, but as a DM you should just be describing what happens. Don't give the illusion of free will to the players by running things in initiative. If your campaign is going to all be about the players trying to escape from the underworld after their demise, for example, just say that at the beginning of the campaign. Start session 0 with that premise. This fight that led them to the underworld in the first place that caused them all to die, you can just describe that. That does not have to be run in initiative. There is a lot more we could talk about when it comes to railroading, but you get the gist of it. Even if the DM thinks it's a good idea to do, it rarely is a good experience for the players. And that's because your job as the DM isn't to write a story, it's just to present scenarios to the players and let them respond to them. Alright, that's all for this one. If you've enjoyed, remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, Nazir North, for more videos like this in the future. And a last point as a bit of an announcement, in celebration of D&D's 50th anniversary this year, I was lucky enough to be a part of a compilation video where 50 different YouTubers from across the world all got to talk about what they love about D&D. So check out the description for the link to that compilation. Cheers everyone, thank you for watching, I will see you next time.